If the Russia-Ukraine war drags on for a few more years, China could realistically rise into the #1 superpower and replace the United States. Not because China is lucky, but because this war is quietly building China the exact advantage stack it needs. Here's the cold mechanism. The longer the war lasts, the more the West bleeds resources and unity, while China collects structural gains, cheap energy, cheaper production, captured markets, and time. Start with the biggest lever, energy. Energy is not just fuel. Energy is the price floor of the entire economy. When energy is cheaper, everything downstream becomes cheaper. Transport, logistics, heating, industrial inputs, chemicals, fertilizers, manufacturing, shipping, exports. And when you can export cheaper at scale, you don't need to win arguments. You win markets. The war forced Russia into a corner. When the West reduced Russian energy purchases, Russia didn't stop selling. It simply shifted sales toward buyers who were willing and powerful enough to buy under pressure. And when a seller is forced to find new buyers, the buyer gets leverage. China used that leverage exactly the way an industrial superpower would. Secure Russian energy at favorable terms and convert that discount into a national cost advantage, not just for one company, for the whole machine. And this is where most people underestimate what's happening. Even a small, consistent advantage in energy input over years doesn't just help China save money. It helps China win price wars. Because price wars don't require a dramatic gap. They require an edge that lasts long enough to do damage. If one side can operate at lower costs for years, it can undercut competitors, take market share, force bankruptcies, and hollow out entire industries. That's the first pillar. Cheap inputs become industrial dominance. Now the second pillar, Russia becomes China's market. When Western brands and suppliers pulled back from Russia, the demand inside Russia didn't vanish. People still need cars, phones, electronics, machinery, components, consumer goods. The economy still needs replacement parts, industrial equipment, and supply chains. So what happens when a huge market loses access to Western supply? Someone fills the gap. China fills the gap. And that's not a minor side effect. That's a long-term strategic win. Because once Russian supply chains rewire around Chinese products, Chinese components, Chinese machinery, reversing that dependence becomes expensive and slow. This is the part nobody says out loud. The war doesn't just push Russia to sell more to China. It pushes Russia to buy more from China. So China benefits on both sides of the loop. Discounted energy on the way in, expanding export dominance on the way out. That's not trade, that's leverage. Now the third pillar, the West bleeds. A long war means the U.S. keeps committing money, weapons, ammo, intelligence, logistics, year after year. But the real cost isn't the headline number. The real cost is what that commitment does to the system. First, it drains industrial bandwidth. Wartime demand consumes factory capacity, supply chains, skilled labor, and political attention. Even if you ramp production, it takes time, and it forces hard trade-offs. Second, it drains political cohesion. The longer the war lasts, the more fatigue grows, the more societies split, the more elections turn into internal wars. Strategic consistency becomes harder. And once consistency collapses, your long-term advantage collapses. Third, it drains focus. The U.S. wants to pressure Russia and contain China at the same time. But no superpower can stay fully locked into two fronts forever without weakening somewhere. One front becomes a magnet. The other front gets breathing room. China understands this better than anyone. And Europe? Europe absorbs the most painful structural shock, energy cost and industrial competitiveness. When energy is expensive, heavy industry loses. When industry loses, growth slows. When growth slows, societies strain. When societies strain, politics radicalize. And when politics radicalize, alliances become fragile. And fragile alliances are exactly what China needs. Because China doesn't need the West to collapse overnight. China needs something much simpler. A long enough period where the West is distracted, divided, and paying the bill, while China compounds its advantage quietly. And there's another layer that makes this even more dangerous: the bridge effect. When trade routes are disrupted and supply chains get political, countries don't stop buying. They reroute. They buy through intermediaries. They buy what's available fast and cheap. And the world's default factory, the one with the scale, speed, and price power to become the supplier of last resort, is China. So the longer this war continues, the more China becomes the default solution for global supply, while the West spends and argues. That is how superpowers lose, not in one dramatic defeat, but in slow erosion. So the core thesis is simple, and it's brutal. A prolonged Russia-Ukraine war doesn't just weaken Russia or Ukraine. It accelerates China's path to replace the United States by giving China cheaper inputs, bigger markets, and a distracted, exhausted West. Now, the real question is not whether China benefits. The real question is, what does China do with this advantage stack? Does it just take market share? Or does it use this moment to permanently crush Western competitiveness, industry by industry, until superpower isn't a debate anymore? In Part 2, we go straight into the mechanism: how cheaper energy and captured markets translate into price domination, industrial hollowing, and a long-term shift in global power, and why Europe could become the biggest economic casualty if this drags on. This is how a war thousands of kilometers away can end up crushing Western competitiveness without China firing a single shot. 1. Cheap energy is a multiplier, not a discount. Most people treat energy like one line item. Fuel prices go up or down. That's not how industrial economies work. Energy is a multiplier. It touches every stage: raw materials, processing, factory power, transportation, warehousing, shipping, retail, final consumer price. So when China secures more favorable energy terms over a long period, it's not just saving money, it's lowering the floor of the entire production chain. And here's the part that matters. When you're already the world's largest manufacturing base, even a small cost advantage becomes a weapon, because you can spread it across millions of units, across thousands of companies, across entire export categories. That means China can run price pressure on the rest of the world in a way few others can match. Not for 1 month, not for 1 quarter, for years. And that's how industries die. Slowly, quietly, and then suddenly. 2. The West can't win a price war while paying a war bill. A price war is brutal even in normal times. But the West isn't in normal times. The US and Europe are dealing with elevated security spending and military resupply, political conflict over budgets and priorities, reshoring attempts that raise costs in the short term, and domestic inflation sensitivity. So while China can undercut, the West faces an ugly dilemma. Option A: match the lower prices and crush margins. Option B: keep prices higher and lose market share. Either way, something breaks. If you match prices, you kill profitability, especially for firms with higher labor costs and higher compliance costs. If you don't match prices, you lose customers and volume, then you lose scale, then you lose bargaining power, then you lose the ability to invest. And once investment slows, innovation slows. And once innovation slows, the decline becomes structural. This is what people miss. China doesn't need to out-invent the West everywhere. It can outlast the West in cost endurance, and cost endurance is enough to hollow out key sectors. 3. How market share becomes system power. Let's be direct. Market share is not just business. Market share becomes supply chain control, standards and dependencies, political influence, and strategic leverage. When China captures a market, it doesn't only sell finished goods. It sells the parts, the machinery, the tools, the components, the intermediate goods that other countries need to keep their own industries alive. That's why this war is such a gift. Russia becomes a near-captive market for Chinese goods and components. But the larger prize is not Russia's consumer market. The larger prize is this: as the West reorganizes, reroutes, and pays the cost of conflict, China becomes the default supplier for anyone who needs things fast, cheap, and in volume. And once you become default, the world builds around you. Shipping lanes, payment channels, supplier networks, equipment compatibility. replacement parts systems. Then leaving becomes expensive. Dependence becomes normal. 4. Europe is the most vulnerable piece of the Western machine. Now we need to talk about Europe, because Europe is where the industrial shock is most dangerous. Europe's strength historically came from high-end manufacturing, chemicals, machinery, autos, industrial engineering, sectors that are heavily sensitive to energy cost stability. When energy becomes expensive or unstable, these sectors don't just lose profit, they lose predictability. And industrial planning without predictability is impossible. A factory isn't an app. You don't pivot overnight. So when energy costs rise and remain uncertain, companies do 3 things: cut production, delay investment, relocate capacity. And once capacity relocates, it rarely comes back quickly. That's why prolonged war stress doesn't just hurt Europe's GDP for 1 year. It can accelerate deindustrialization, the slow shrinking of Europe's industrial core. And if Europe deindustrializes, the West loses something huge, a major pillar of its manufacturing and export strength. China benefits from that in 2 ways. Europe buys more imports as local output weakens, and China faces less competition globally from European industrial champions. 5. The bridge effect. China sells to everyone through every crack. When sanctions, controls, and political blocs appear, trade doesn't stop, it reroutes. Some goods go through intermediaries. Some components get relabeled. Some supply chains become layered. Country A, Country B, Country C. And in those reroutes, China sits in the center because it produces so many categories of goods that any detour eventually touches Chinese manufacturing somewhere. So even when the West tries to decouple, a prolonged war creates urgency and shortages. Urgency and shortages force buyers to choose availability over ideology. This is the uncomfortable truth. When people need parts to keep factories running, they buy what they can get. China profits from that reality. 6. How this ends. The West's slow erosion, China's compounding advantage. This is the pattern. The West spends to sustain the war and manage domestic politics. Europe absorbs energy shocks and industrial strain. Supply chains get more political and more expensive. China secures favorable inputs and expands export reach. Over time, China accumulates market share, dependency, and leverage. It's not one big event, it's compounding. And compounding is how superpowers are built. So when people ask, why would certain U.S. political forces push to end the war quickly? The answer is simple. Because a long war risks becoming a strategic trap, not just against Russia, but against the U.S. itself. A long war turns into budget bleed, unity bleed, industrial bleed, focus bleed. And every year of bleed is a year China gets stronger relative to you. Now here's the key question that sets up part 3. Even if China is gaining power through cheaper costs and captured markets, does that automatically mean China replaces the U.S.? Not automatically. Because there's one force that can reverse everything. The moment the U.S. stops bleeding and changes the rules of the system. And that brings us to the final part. In part 3, we'll break down the endgame. Why ending the war becomes a strategic reset button for Washington. What happens if Russia freezes the conflict instead of losing? How China's gains could turn into overreach. And the one scenario where the war keeps going and the U.S. still wins. That's the real battle. Not who wins the next headline, but who controls the system after the war. If part 1 was the thesis and part 2 was the mechanism, part 3 is the endgame. Because here's the truth, China gaining from a long war doesn't automatically mean China replaces the United States. It means China gets a historic window. And the real question is whether the U.S. closes that window fast enough or lets it compound until it's irreversible. So let's talk about how this actually ends. 1. Why ending the war isn't about peace. It's about stopping the bleed. From Washington's perspective, the war has a hidden cost that grows with time. Strategic distraction, plus budget drain, plus industrial bandwidth, plus political division. The longer it lasts, the more it pulls America into a permanent posture of emergency. And emergency posture is expensive, chaotic, and politically toxic. That's why a push to end the war isn't necessarily pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. It can simply be a recognition that a prolonged war creates the exact environment where China thrives. Cheap inputs, Cheap exports, fractured Western unity, and U.S. attention split across two fronts. So the U.S. incentive becomes simple: stop the bleeding. Because once the bleeding stops, America can do what it does best: change the rules, mobilize capital, and reorganize the system around its strengths. 2. The frozen war scenario, the most likely outcome. Nobody wants to say out loud. There's a scenario that keeps showing up in modern conflicts: a frozen front, not total victory, not total defeat. A ceasefire, a line, a prolonged standoff, something that stops the rapid burn rate but doesn't solve the political dispute. Why does this matter? Because a frozen conflict changes the economics instantly. U.S. and European support becomes more manageable. Industrial resupply becomes predictable. Political fatigue eases. Markets stabilize. And most importantly, Western leaders can refocus on China. In other words, a frozen war is not a happy ending, but it can be a strategic reset. And that is exactly what China does not want: the West regaining coherence and turning back toward the real long-term competitor. 3. How the U.S. can still win even after losing years. People underestimate America because they focus on headlines and short-term chaos. But U.S. power isn't just military. It's a system: the world's deepest capital markets, the strongest alliance network, control over key technology choke points, global financial plumbing, and a massive domestic resource base. So if the U.S. stops bleeding and shifts strategy, it has tools China fears. Here are 3 ways Washington can flip the board. 1. Industrial mobilization plus reshoring at scale. If the U.S. treats long-term competition like wartime economics, tax incentives, procurement guarantees, industrial policy, then cost disadvantages shrink over time. It's slow, but it's real. 2. Tech choke points. China can manufacture at scale, but advanced chips, software ecosystems, and key research nodes still run through Western-controlled bottlenecks. If the U.S. tightens those with discipline, China's climb becomes harder. 3. Alliance rebinding. China benefits most when the West is divided. If the war ends or stabilizes, and Europe regains political space, the West can rebuild coherence, trade blocs, defense coordination, supply chain rerouting with time instead of panic. China's advantage is strongest in chaos. America's advantage is strongest when it has time to organize. 4. The overreach trap. How China's win can turn into a problem. Now here's the twist. China winning cheap energy and market share isn't free. There's a risk China can't avoid: overdependence and overreach. If China becomes too tied to discounted Russian energy and too tied to fragile detour trade routes, it inherits exposure. Sanction risk, shipping risk, payment risk, and political risk. And if Europe and the U.S. eventually stabilize and coordinate, they can push back in ways that hurt China's margins. Tariffs, industrial subsidies at home, targeted restrictions on key sectors, and supply chain diversification with real investment over time. China's model works best when it can sell everywhere. If the West becomes disciplined and patient, it can make the global market less friendly to Chinese dominance, especially in strategic sectors. So yes, a long war helps China. But China still has a problem. Its rise is easier when the world stays open, and the West still has the power to partially close it. 5. The one scenario where the war drags on, and China still wins big. So what's the nightmare scenario for the West? It's not that Ukraine loses tomorrow. It's this: the war drags on long enough to permanently damage Europe's industrial base, while the U.S. stays politically divided and unable to sustain long-term strategy, and China keeps compounding advantages through cheap inputs, export dominance, and market capture. That scenario looks like this. Europe keeps paying higher energy and higher security costs. European industry relocates or shrinks. Western politics fractures into support forever versus stop funding now. U.S. focus stays split between Russia and China. China keeps expanding into every gap: Russia, Global South, and even parts of Europe through supply chain dependence. In that world, China doesn't need to defeat America militarily. America's system decays under its own contradictions, while China stays coherent and compounds. That's how superpowers fall, not by invasion but by exhaustion. 6. The conclusion: this war is a test of endurance, not morality. So here's the real ending. A prolonged Russia-Ukraine war is not only a European war, it's a stress test of the Western system. If the West stays united, stabilizes energy and industry, and regains strategic focus, China's advantage window can close. But if the war becomes permanent, if Europe weakens structurally, and if U.S. politics remains fractured, then yes, China's path to replacing the United States stops being a theory. It becomes the most likely outcome. Because in the modern world, the winner isn't always the one who fights hardest. It's the one who turns chaos into compound advantage. And right now, the longer this war lasts, the more China is the only country doing exactly that.